Hi, I'm Stephen Betts. You're listening to Scholars and Saints. Today on Scholars and Saints, I'm chatting with Professor Stephen Taysom about Latter-day Saint President Joseph F. Smith. The nephew of church founder Joseph Smith Jr., Joseph F. Smith witnessed many of the most striking events of early Mormonism, from his childhood in Nauvoo to his adolescence on the Midwestern plains, to the settlement of the Great Basin in Utah, and more. A complex figure, Smith was known as much for his courage as for his temper. He was supremely confident in public, yet privately insecure. He was a committed polygamist, yet he was responsible for transitioning the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints into a new era of exclusive monogamy. In this episode, we'll discuss Smith's complicated life and reflect on what it means to apply the methods of religious studies to biography. Please note, this episode contains descriptions of domestic violence that some listeners may find disturbing. I'm pleased to welcome Stephen Taysom here today. Dr. Taysom is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Comparative Religion at Cleveland State University. He's the author of two books, Shakers, Mormons, and Religious Worlds, Conflicting Visions, Contested Boundaries, and Dimensions of Faith, a Mormon Studies Reader. He's also the author of a number of articles on Mormonism and the academic study of religion. Thanks for being with us here today, Steve.
Well, thanks for having me.
We're talking about Dr. Taysom's biography, Like a Fiery Meteor, The Life of Joseph F. Smith, which is under contract with the University of Utah Press. Steve, your previous work in Mormon studies has focused primarily on comparative religion, religious studies methods, and things like that. So tell us what attracted you to writing in this mode of biography and to Joseph F. Smith in particular?
I wasn't attracted to biography, and I'm still not, actually. It's as a genre, it's very difficult, and we can talk about that as we go through. But I was attracted to Joseph F. Smith first because I had always heard some of the stories about him, just kind of growing up. And when I was in graduate school, an article came out in Sunstone magazine by Scott Kenny, who had previously been working on a biography of Joseph F. Smith. And I read the article and I was fascinated by this character. Now, that article focuses on some of the more difficult elements of his personality, Joseph F. Smith's personality. And I was just fascinated by him and kind of put that in my mind as, once I get out of graduate school and have my first book published, what's my next project going to be? And my advisor asked me, in fact, right around that time, what's your next project going to be? Of course, I had no idea. So I just said Joseph F. Smith because I just read the article. And that just became I created that reality by speaking it. And that's kind of where I was. And then the more I sort of learned about him, the more interested I was in the complexity of this character. Was kind of mesmerizing, and it endless. I never got bored with him. Biography itself, so it started off as I was interested in the subject, and then the biographical subject, and then the method had to be biography, right? So that's what I ended up doing.
Yeah, so Joseph F. Smith is really fascinating for a lot of reasons, not least of which is his personality. As I think some readers may be surprised to find, he had a very, well, we could say fiery temperament, as you allude to in the title. I think when we were talking earlier, you said that that's actually a self-characterization. He calls himself the fiery meteor later in life. Is that right?
Yeah, so it wasn't a secret to anybody, least of all him, that he had a monstrous temper, I think we could say. And in fact, there were times in his life when he said, I think one of the quotes was, "I fear no man on earth except Joseph F. Smith." And then the fiery meteor quote came from a letter he wrote to his friend, Samuel Adams. And in 1888, he wrote he kind of reminiscing about his earlier life before his first mission and after, so the period between when his mother died and when he went on this mission. And he described himself during that period as like a fiery meteor, out of control, thing. But what a lot of people note is that he was pretty much a fiery meteor all the way through his, 80 years of life.
In a more restrained way, but you can kind of see this behind the scenes. Personality still comes out during the Reed Smoot hearings in the ways that he seems to be very calm under pressure, but he's also very clearly not afraid of this sort of adversarial attention that he's getting from some of the best lawyers in the country, from Congress.
Yeah, he's I think you're right. I mean, in the 1870s, he almost beats a man. He beats a man almost to death. And this is when he was in the, the corner of the 12 apostles. And he beats this guy almost to death. I mean, so he's not afraid of anything. He's often overcome with this rage. And certainly he presents himself at the Smoot hearings, which are, toward the end of his life, as an enemy facing an enemy, right? So that's kind of how he saw the world. I mean, he did have a kind of dualistic nature about him, that everything's out to get me and I have to fight everything all the time. He also had a very tremendously vulnerable heart, which I think is part of this whole thing. And obviously, I didn't get into a lot of psychology here because psychobiography is kind of a remnant of the past and probably better left there. But I don't think it takes a lot of psychological insider speculation to suggest that his childhood was deeply traumatic and that had an effect on the way he approached the rest of his life. I mean, he viewed his entire existence through that lens of early trauma, and it was never far from his thoughts or his words. And I'm talking about, of course, the murder of his father and the death of his mother. And his personality, I found, was closer to that of his mother and her family than it was to the Smiths. So her family, the Fieldings, were known as, his mother, I think I say in the book, collected grudges, as if it were a hobby. And her whole family, Joseph F. Smith actually goes on his first mission to England. He wants to meet them. And so we're talking about her brothers, and he meets them, and they're just tremendously abusive to him. And he essentially meets people that are in some ways a lot like him. And it's a fascinating kind of little moment in his life. But yeah, it never stops. He's like that until the very end.
In a lot of ways, he reminds me of his namesake, Mormon founder Joseph Smith, just kind of this passion for life, but also everything he does is passionate. It's extra. It's full speed ahead, whether that's in personal relationships or in his callings for the church, his missionary work, his interpersonal struggles with neighbors and perceived enemies. So I wonder, Steve, if you could take us through some of the high points of Smith's life. You refer to him in the book as JFS to kind of disambiguate all of the Joseph Smiths in Mormon history, which are many.
Yeah, so we can talk about the name thing first. I mean, so it confuses everybody. So people who aren't familiar with Mormon studies think I'm writing about Joseph Smith Jr. People who are, they think I'm writing about Joseph Fielding Smith, right? Who is Joseph? So Joseph F. Smith's name is Joseph Fielding Smith. His son, one of his many children, is named Joseph F. Smith Jr. But he's known to LDS church members as Joseph Fielding Smith, because he becomes church president, member of 12 church president, I think 1970 or something like that, 69, 70, as a very old man. And then there's John Smith, there are multiple John Smiths. And anyway, so I call him JFS just because, you can't say Joseph and you can't say Smith. So Fielding, that doesn't even work, right? So I use that as the reference point for him. But, he's born in 1838. In November of 1838 in Missouri, which, if you know anything about LDS history, you know that that's right in the middle of this Mormon war in Missouri. He is taken to Liberty Jail as a baby to receive the ordinance of being named and blessed as a baby by his father. So that happens in Liberty Jail, right? This famous, iconic experience for Mormons, right? He's there as a baby. Which I think is just so appropriate for him. And he, of course, goes to Nauvoo. And probably the smoothest period of his life is from 1840 to 1844. All 5.5 years of it, right, is this kind of, in his mind, this idyllic period, and probably was pretty good. He went to school for a while. He played with his cousins. He had those kinds of experiences. Spent a lot of time with his mother. Spent a lot of time with his dad. And then, of course, his father's murdered in the summer of 1844, and that changes everything for everybody, right? So his father is the brother of Joseph Smith Jr. His father's Hiram Smith, murdered in June of 1844. Then, he sort of becomes his mother's defender and supporter as a child. So he has some siblings. He has half siblings and he has a sister. And so they all kind of, his brother, his half brother, John, there's always a kind of tension between them. But Mary Smith, his mother, Mary Fielding was her maiden name. She's obviously the second wife of Hiram Smith, his first wife, Jerusha, died, and he married Mary Fielding, who was an English convert to Mormonism. They go across the plains, because famous stories of Joseph F. Smith driving cattle across the plains, driving the oxen. They get to Utah, and then she dies in 1852. And so he's an orphan. And that's the period, apparently, where he kind of starts to show a lot of these, I don't want to call them antisocial tendencies, but certainly given the environment he was in and given his experiences with these kind of traumas in his life, it would have been very easy for him to go and be, an outlaw or something like that. I mean, it's not inconceivable that could have been where he ended up, but he ends up going on this mission to Hawaii. And it's during that period that he really kind of, at least in his later memory, this is the period where he finds his testimony of the church and his love for the Hawaiian people, although that in the contemporary diaries is not quite as evident as he remembers it being. He comes back from that experience. He marries his first marriage, which ends in a very nasty divorce. It was a very troubled marriage. We can talk maybe a little bit about that later, but he gets married, then he goes almost immediately on a second mission to Great Britain, where he's in the early 1860s, comes home, is sent back to Hawaii to deal with this character that was kind of running. He kind of beguiled Brigham Young and some others, and he goes to Hawaii and to the South Pacific as well, and sort of sets up his own little kingdom there. His last name is Gibson. And so Joseph F. Smith is sent to Hawaii with a few others to kind of see what's going on with this guy and get rid of him. Comes back from that, marries other times, becomes a polygamist. His first wife divorces him. And then he is called on a mission to Great Britain as the president of the European mission, right? So, and really his job there was to oversee immigration. So states immigrating from the Northern European countries primarily would come through England and leave from Liverpool. And so he spent some years there as mission president, comes back, and then is sent back again in the late 1870s as the mission president a second time. But he's only there for a few months. Brigham Young dies, and he comes back. Then he was made an apostle in 1866, put into the first presidency in 1866, and then is put into the quorum of the 12 apostles the next year. Then he just kind of spends his time doing a lot of church work, a lot of traveling. And then in the 1880s, he is sent on the underground during these sort of the federal government starts to ramp up its prosecution of polygamists. And Joseph F. Smith is sent back to Hawaii largely because he had knowledge. He had worked for many years in the endowment house in Salt Lake City, and he had performed a lot of polygamous sealings there. And he was familiar with the records because he had also worked in the church historian's office. And so they wanted to get him as far away from this as they could because they knew that he would be a target. They knew that he had a lot of evidence. And so he was moved to Hawaii, and he did not like that. He was surprisingly enough, very angry about this. And so he spent his time in Hawaii complaining about being there. And particularly when he found out that one of his wife's homes had been raided and they had been put out in the street. And he was almost beside himself with fury over this. And a few years before he was actually able to come back. And then he becomes president of the church in 1901, goes through the whole Reed Smoot adventure, was kind of oversees the implementation of the second manifesto, saying basically we're really serious now about people not practicing polygamy. He oversees the excommunication of a couple of high-profile church leaders who are practicing plural marriage, and kind of is part of this whole Americanization of Mormonism, which I talk about in the book. And then in 1918, in the fall, in November, he dies. In October, he shows up at General Conference. He'd been very sick through most of that summer. And when he was able to show up at General Conference in October, a lot of people were very shocked by this. And then, of course, he dies in November. But just before that, he produces this revelation, which may be his most famous contribution to Mormonism, which is now for Latter-day Saints in the LDS Church. It's Doctrine and Covenants, section 138, the vision of the redemption of the dead. And along the way, he marries 5 more times in addition to the first one. He has, and I always forget the exact number, I think it's 45 children, and he adopted several.
In fact, his first child is adopted, right?
Yeah. So the first one that he brings back is when he's married to his first wife. He actually brings this child, Edward, home from England. He brought him back. He always had this amazing kind of almost crippling empathy for young, disadvantaged children. And again, you don't need a lot of psychological speculation to get to why that would be, right? I mean, so he sees himself in those people, and he sees his mother in those people, and so he's kind of got this, like everybody, he's got these conflicting attitudes. He very rarely shows that kind of empathy towards other men. Children and women are frequently the object of his empathy, although the situation with his first wife probably ought to be discussed in terms of the violence that went on in that marriage, or will be accused of hiding something.
Yeah. So say more. I think, this, we mentioned earlier, his personality. I think a lot of people would be surprised to know about his relationship with his first wife and sort of what that adds to his story.
Yeah. So this story about the first wife, her name was Lavera, and she was actually his first cousin. She's the daughter of Samuel Smith. So Samuel Smith is one of the younger brothers of Joseph and Hiram Smith, famous in LDS circles for being like the first missionary, right? So he gets the Book of Mormon and he heads out to proselytize. He also died in Nauvoo shortly after. He wasn't murdered with them, but he died of an illness shortly after that. And he marries her, and it's troubled from the very beginning. And we don't have a lot of evidence for, a lot of it's speculative, but the main source for this would be his letters to her from Britain, and her letters to him during his first his mission to Britain. So his second mission, but his first to England. And then the divorce statements that they wrote up to give to Brigham Young when their marriage had become untenable. And if anybody's read the Scott Kenny article, then I think that they know a lot of the kind of more dramatic details of the story. But it was almost destined to kind of fail because he was at that point still very much unreconstructed in terms of his sense of self. And she seemed to suffer from some kind of severe depression. Again, it's difficult to diagnose this stuff, but she would spend months where she couldn't get out of bed, and they were frustrated because there was nothing apparently physically wrong with her. So why can't she get up and do something? And why is she always sad? And it was a kind of classic sort of description of somebody with like a major depressive disorder or something like that. When he returns from England, there is some frustration that they haven't been able to have a child of their own. And he actually makes some statements to her to the effect of, you can't have children. And there is this suspicion, why can't you? And then he also uses that to kind of fuel his jealousy that he has, that because she apparently is unable to conceive, she's might be out with other men. And he actually finds her with other men, not, necessarily compromising situations, but alone with them. And this draws violent outbursts from Joseph F. Smith towards the guy that she was with. He sort of smashes a chair and threatens to kill the guy. But there are also more disturbing stories that she offers up and that he doesn't deny, that he beat her. And the interesting thing is that in these documents that are submitted to Brigham Young for his perusal to kind of get him up to speed on this, she says that Joseph F. Smith beat her with a rope. And he says, I beat her, but I didn't beat her with a rope. I beat her with a stick. And so it's a window into what that culture at that time considered transgressive, right? So you're going to deny the thing that's seen as being wrong. And so what he denies is, I didn't use the rope. That would have been, inhumane. I used the stick. But there was definitely what we would have to call domestic violence. I mean, and it's not contested. I mean, she accuses him of it. He admits it. It happened. And I have not seen any evidence that it happened to any of the other wives. I didn't come across any evidence like that, but it definitely happened to his first wife, Lavera. And yeah, I mean, it's a toxic relationship, made more toxic by his violence towards her, obviously. And yeah, I mean, it has to be dealt with. And it's one of those things it's difficult. And it's one of those things that as a biographer, I look at it and I realize, so kind of in a no-win situation in terms of the way you tell the story, because on the one hand, you're going to have people say, you didn't make him monstrous enough for having done this. And then there are other people that are going to say, why would you bring this up and make a monster out of this man? So you go into it realizing you can't please everyone, I guess, in terms of the way you present it. But so particularly with this, I just tried to present it in terms of what happened and then what did it mean to those people at that time that it happened. And yeah, it's not an easy chapter to write, I say. It was sort of depressing.
Yeah, Steve, I think you do a really great job of dealing with this. When dealing with this kind of historical material, we never want to diminish the severity of this kind of violence. And at the same time, we also want to demonstrate the kind of masculinity the kind of manhood that Joseph F. Smith is committed to. He very much sees himself within a kind of frontier inflected manhood, a Victorian manhood that condones violence, right? And that is very physical, is very aggressive. And I think this, this episode, as well as other episodes, demonstrate that aspect of his personality. And we're going to talk about some other aspects of his personality as well. But this is really an important part of his identity, is this sense. And you mentioned earlier, he's furious when he gets sent during the raids, the polygamy raids to Hawaii, because he believes he has this very invested sense of a real man stands up to his enemies, right? Like he says this to Brigham Young too, right? Brigham Young brought up on murder charges in 1871 ish. And the question is, do we let him stay down south in hiding, or do we bring him up to face the charges? And JFS says, absolutely, he comes to face the charges. That's what a man does. And so he has this sense of what manhood entails, and manhood is violent, manhood is passionate, manhood is courageous, and also significantly for him in certain ways, and certainly towards the end of his life, emotionally sensitive in a lot of ways, which is a little bit surprising in the context of Victorian manhood.
There's always the difficulty when you talk about this kind of stuff, when you contextualize it, which that's our job, right? I mean, is to put it in the world where it happened. Is you don't ever want to come across as justifying anything, right? Because why would you? I mean, it's horrifying, right? These activities are just awful. But at the same time, what's the project here, right? We're trying to get a handle on who this person is and what, what's motivating this stuff, and considering him in the entirety of his life, just sort of trying to figure him out if you can, which I couldn't, by the way. Spoiler alert. He remains enigmatic to me. But yeah, so I think that all this stuff about masculinity, which he's sort of obsessed with, I think he uses it as a way of justifying in his own mind his inability to control himself in that way. And it's one of the ironies, I think, of this, that he preaches self-control, particularly sexual self-control. I mean, this is the kind of, I think I talk about this in the book, right? He's sort of, in some ways, he's the architect of this idea that morality equals sexual morality within Mormonism. And so if you say someone's immoral, right, that's what in the Mormon world, what that means sex, right? So, and he is partially responsible for kind of popularizing that idea, but he's unrestrained when it comes to conflict and violence. And so there's clearly a kind of moral map that he's following here. And the masculinity thing explains it to a point, but he's so much farther than everybody else, the other men that he's encountering. So you have to remember, so this is a world where what we would now call toxic masculinity was the kind of norm. I mean, this was expected. And he was considered toxically masculine by these other toxic males. So that kind of gives you a sense of where he's at on this spectrum. And yes, he's obsessed with physical courage and physical strength. He was very, very strong. And he talks about this particularly in letters. His journals aren't quite as expository as his letters are. So his journals tend to be very matter of fact in terms of recording where he went, how many miles he traveled, and what he talked about. But his letters are much more useful. And he will make a note to people of how physically strong he is. And he talks about, when he's, I think in his late 40s or something, he's able to do this thing called skin the cat, which is like this gymnastics move, which I had to look up. I didn't know what it was. He said he skin a cat. Anyway, you like pull yourself up and do these other things. I mean, it was just insane. He's incredibly strong and very physically fit, and compares himself to other church leaders in letters regarding their physical fitness. Makes jokes at the expense of George A. Smith's weight, even though he was almost like a father figure to him, but he never let him get away without knowing that, he sort of looked down on the idea that he was so corpulent.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have this great moment in the book where he's engaging in these exchanges, these letters with his first wife, Elvira, and he pauses to tell her, yeah, I I think this is in New York, right? He's like, yeah, I used this machine that allowed me to lift a really heavy weight over my head. And she's like, who cares? Stop it. You're going to throw your back out.
Yeah, because he always had these back problems. Yeah, so he had these back problems, but yeah, he was always into these. It's almost Festivus, right? So it's December 22nd. Yeah, he's always into the feats of strength, and yeah, so he would always any challenge that he would see like that he would do, and so yeah, he found something that he could lift, and and he did actually pay the price because later on in his life he did have severe back problems. So she may have been right, but he did other weird things. I mean, so his trips to New York, he loved to go to the P.T. Barnum Museum there. And he was this is one of the things that I found. It didn't really have any super big significance in the book, but it was just interesting to me that was, of course there was no internet, no phones, nothing to, no binge watching. So he would go and binge watch the quote unquote freaks, right, as they were called then, at the museum. And he was very impressed with, I think Tom Thumb was there and some other people, and he wrote about them in terms that we wouldn't use today. But he was endlessly curious and was extremely well educated, even though it was totally informal. Very well spoken. He has by the time he gets to adulthood, he's got a tremendous vocabulary and a very natural sense of what it takes to organize something and make it work. So it's not a surprise to me that Brigham Young saw value in him. And the story has often been, well, he wanted to kind of bring Hiram's son close to him and nurture him up. I don't believe that for a minute. Brigham Young's relationship with Hiram Smith wasn't particularly good. And I think Brigham Young saw in Joseph F. Smith tremendous native intelligence, courage, strength, all of this stuff that he could tap and use. And he did.
I mean, that's a story in itself. You talk about in the book how in fact, the first presidency in 1866 comes to the church historian's office where JFS is working at the time, and they're performing some temple rituals, right? Temple related rituals there. And all of a sudden, right before they dismiss, Brigham Young stands up and says, "You know what? I just got the call from God. It's time to make to ordain Joseph F. Smith an apostle and put him in the first presidency." Right? Just kind of there you go, right there.
Yeah, and he just gets up and they're doing a prayer circle. He gets up and he's getting ready to take his, ceremonial clothing off. He says, "Oh, by the way, Joseph F. Smith, the kid working downstairs, we're going to put him in this." And anybody got a problem with that sort of thing? And of course, nobody did, right? I mean, it was like, yeah, okay. So my dad got him and ordained him an apostle, put him in the first presidency, didn't put him in the Quorum of the 12 immediately, which was common in the 19th century. There were all kinds of apostles. I think every one of Brigham Young's sons was an apostle when they were like 2 years old. I'm exaggerating, but they were children. I mean, he did that. So, and in fact, they go through different phases in the 19th century of trying to figure out how to determine seniority in the Quorum of the 12. And they do it by age, and they do it by, should it be by date of ordination or date of entry into the quorum? And eventually they settle on date of entry into the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, which actually makes it so that Brigham Young Jr. does not become president of the church. He would have become president of the church instead of Joseph F. Smith if that had been decided differently. But yeah, that's how he gets called into it. And his response to it is almost, of course you're going to call me in. I mean, his confidence was such that it was just like, well, yeah, I mean, this is what I'm kind of born for. And he always, this may be an answer to a different question, but he always saw himself as an outsider, even inside the hierarchy. And even in the first presidency, when you had John Taylor and George Q. Cannon and Joseph F. Smith, those two, Taylor and Cannon, would stay together, right? And Woodruff and Cannon would stay together. And they would leave Joseph F. Smith kind of by himself, like when they would travel. And he was always sort of, he saw himself as an outsider. And I think a lot of them saw him as an outsider. There could be a number of reasons for that, why they would kind of treat him a little differently. Partially because in some ways he was a good guy to stay away from. But he always sort of viewed himself that way. And he had a real problem with the idea that there was this church in the Midwest. I'm talking about at what was then known as the RLDS church. His cousins, Joseph Smith's sons, had, sort of become leaders in this church, right? And he felt like his father's legacy was being destroyed, diluted, and erased. Which is why when he becomes president of the church, and I got to be careful how I say that. He puts two of his sons in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. His brother has been the church patriarch for some time, but his brother is the one who ordains him president of the church. And so there's clearly, and there's a lot more about this in the book, but there is clearly the sense in which he is attempting to bring his father's family back into these circles of leadership where he feels that they belong and he feels like they've been shafted out of for a long time.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it feels very reminiscent of the kinds of psychology that Richard Bushman talks about for Joseph Smith Jr., which is that a lot of his project, a lot of his theological project is even wrapped up in his relationship with his father, right? Not to, we don't want to go too deep into the psychology, but Bushman notes this, that he wants to redeem his family in a certain kind of way, and it seems like that's also at play for Joseph Fielding Smith.
Yeah, I mean, he's convinced that his family has this, what they call believing blood, and they're kind of obsessed with this idea that, and Joseph Smith isn't the only one who thinks this, but that, they've got this special birthright, that they have to be true to, right? So he uses this to kind of motivate his children to behave themselves. But his obsession with family lineage shows up when he has a son, and I talk about him in the book. I don't know that I need to say his name on the podcast. There's one son in particular that Joseph Smith has a hard time understanding. And he writes to the mission president. This son goes on a mission, and he writes to the mission president, and he says, I'm not asking for any special favors for my son, which, of course, I mean, why else would the president of the church be writing this, or a member of the first presidency, or whoever he was at the time? But he says, you have to remember about him, he's a Richards, and because of that, he's got kind of a sensitive nature. Now, if we know what we know about Joseph F. Smith is he's basically saying that this guy is not quite up to the manliness, like the tasks that might be expected of somebody who was more appropriately masculine. He wasn't suggesting anything more than that, anything deeper than that, just that he might not be able to, he's a little wimpy. He's not quite up to it. And he pins that on the fact that he's a Richards. Right. So it's because his mother is Sarah Richards. But this idea that you can trace family traits, right? That well, if he's showing this kind of weakness, it can't be from me. It can't be from my side of it. It has to be from hers. And that he's open about it is fascinating to me.
Well, it almost makes you think about, some of the contemporary, this is late 19th century, right? Some of the contemporary anthropological theories about, inheritance, phenotype, those kinds of things, what we today call scientific racism. The idea that there are racial stocks and that those stocks have particular traits that are transmitted through blood. Of course, even that idea is going to play a huge role in the 20th century, administration of the priesthood and temple ban in terms of actual blood. In the LDS hospital, they're going to segregate that blood by race. So there's this idea, again, that there's something about blood that can actually scientifically maybe even carry traits that maybe even are spiritual, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so it maps really well onto that kind of contemporary world. And which is why when he says things like that, nobody reacts strangely to it. They just say, yeah, that must be right. And I think Brigham Young is the one who says, God has watched the blood circulate through all the generations until they end up in Joseph Smith. So he's kind of primed for that idea.
So Steve, what surprised you about what have you learned about Joseph Fielding Smith that you didn't know that surprised you as you were doing the research for this book?
Well, I think, it's I have to sort of search my memory banks. As we were talking about a little earlier, I've been working on this book for quite some time. And so it's hard to remember what actually surprised me and what I've been living with for all this time. I think initially I was surprised by, right, we know about his courage. We know about his strength. We know about his fierceness, his ferocity and his anger and all that. And we also know, I think to a degree, anybody who knows anything about him knows about his sensitivity because he loses 13 children to death, and that affects him tremendously, more than it affected many of his contemporaries who lost children. But one of the things that surprised me, so we knew those things, but one of the things that surprised me was the fact that he did actually complain a fair amount about church work. Now, before anybody listening to this sort of freaks out and accuses me of defaming him, he wanted to come home from England. And this was, I think, during his first mission. George Q. Cannon was the mission president, and he kept delaying Joseph F. Smith's return home. And he was so frustrated with it. He was writing these letters saying, I don't know when this guy's going to let me leave, because he was waiting. I think he made Joseph F. Smith escort his wife home, escort one of George Q. Cannon's wives home. And he was super frustrated with this and complained and just, was just like, I'm done with this. I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go home. And that surprised me because I was like, well, geez, this guy, he's just like everybody else, right? I mean, he's a person. He gets tired of this stuff. When he comes back from his mission presidency in England, there's this rumor that he came home because he was sick, and he's so angry about this because he's like, I don't get sick. I'm not sick. I'm not sick. I'm fine. I'm not sick. However, the other thing that surprised me is that when he was in England, he had a cold the entire time. And he writes about this cold that never goes away. And he writes about it and says, they shouldn't send, we really should reconsider sending people here because it's just not good for us. This climate is terrible, right? He surprised me when Brigham Young was very interested in moving the church's headquarters from Liverpool to London. So forever it had been in the north of England. That's where the north and west of England is where most of the early converts came from. And Liverpool was the church's headquarters there for a long, long time because of the port. And Brigham Young wanted to move it to London. And Joseph Smith didn't like this idea. He didn't particularly care for London, but Brigham Young gave him this list of things he needed, right? He needed it to be near the ports, near the railroads, in a good neighborhood, cheap. I mean, basically all these things are mutually exclusive, right? You don't find good neighborhoods at the port. You don't find cheap property in good neighborhoods, right? And so Joseph F. Smith sort of complained privately that I can't do this. This is a dumb idea, basically. But to Brigham Young, he says, oh, yep, I'll do it. I'll go check. And of course he checks and there's nothing there, right? Because and then he tries to explain it to him in really rational kind of terms. And he says, we've got the printing press here for the Millennial Star, which is the church's publication in Britain. And he says, our press is so old that if we try to move it, it'll just fall apart. So we'll have to buy a new one. And that kind of, that sort of eats into the state. So he pre-approaches him that way with this. He's a smart guy. So I was surprised by that. I was surprised by his intelligence. I didn't necessarily think he was dumb, but I didn't know that he was as smart as he turned out to be, in my opinion. Yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff. I guess the sort of private stuff, which unsurprisingly is surprising.
Yeah, all the stuff you've mentioned, a number of those things surprised me as well. I think, like you said, some of the stuff that I really enjoyed and found surprising was, some of this private kind of humanizing stuff where, for example, he's in England and he's in charge of immigration and he finds out that he can save a bunch of money by concealing the ages of children. And so he has these 4-year-olds that are being wrapped up like infants. And he's like, just carry him onto the boat.
Yeah, I think he was recommending like up to 8 years old or something. Yeah, just like, just let him challenge you on it and see if, and see what happens. Yeah. And this brings to mind something else, which is that he actually, he's a very straight-laced person, obviously, but there are times where he makes what seem like kind of slightly off-color innuendos. So he's writing to somebody, and I have to go back and look at the manuscript to see exactly when this was.
I think it's Samuel Adams, right? I think it's Samuel Adams that he's writing to. Are you talking about the poem that he writes?
I forgot about the poem. I forgot about that one. This one, the one I was thinking of right now, you can talk about the poem in a second, but the one that I was thinking of was, he talks about his exercise routine or something. And he says, I exercise and I use up all my strength and then have some left over for where, if my wife is handy or something to that effect, right? And then when he's a kid on his mission in Hawaii, he gets these letters from his friend who says, have you ever seen any naked women there? Have you seen, and when I saw this letter, I couldn't believe it, right? It was like, they're in the collection. And he's like, they're private parts or something like that. Like, you see, and of course, they're like 15 years old. I mean, so the response isn't recorded, but that gives you a sense, right, of that he was just a normal person. What were you going to say about the poem?
Oh, yeah. You include this poem in the book that I really had a good chuckle about when I was reading, and he's writing to his friend this kind of innuendo, but yeah, just this kind of off-color humor that you don't expect to find in a guy like this who spends his entire life as this kind of church leader and the spiritual figurehead, and certainly in subsequent historiography has been, and we should talk about historiography actually, in subsequent historiography has really been lionized as pure, squeaky clean kind of guy. And no, he is very much, we've talked about conceptions of masculinity. He's very much a man of his time. And that really shows in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to suggest that he's like Lenny Bruce or something, but I mean, it's not all the time, but it's there, and so that kind of earthiness does show through occasionally, which is refreshing, But like you say, it's not the way we think of somebody, who is in a position, which is weird. I mean, it's not. it's predictable, but it's also a little strange, right? We sort of, it's kind of hagiography of, they're not a person anymore. They are elevated to this position. It somehow changes their humanity, which I think is a mistake, really a setup for disappointment to think about anybody that way.
Yeah, and I mentioned historiography. Joseph F. Smith has a tremendous legacy and a long-term effect on Latter-day Saint historiography, in particular, internal sort of devotional historiography of the 19th century, and that's largely due to his own participation in the church historian's office, but even to a much greater extent, it's his son. Right, Joseph Fielding Smith spends 50 years in the church historian's office and largely, sculpts not just the official narrative of Latter-day Saint history, but kind of the entire worldview of what it means to be Mormon in the 20th century. I don't know if that's overstating the case, but that certainly seems to be.
I don't think so. I mean, and then to further the influence, so we have Joseph F. Smith, right? And then we've got Joseph Fielding Smith, who, as you say, is an apostle, church historian, later church president, and publishes all kinds of stuff, historical and otherwise, and then sort of runs the church historical department as his own fiefdom, right, where he actually controls access to the documents. He's the one that Leonard Arrington has to go see to get documents in the 50s just to write his, or 40s or 50s to write his dissertation, which becomes Great Basin Kingdom. He has to give he sees him, he has to give personal approval for this. And then his Joseph Fielding Smith, so Joseph F. Smith Jr.'s daughter, marries Bruce R. McConkie. So who of course then does unquestionably shapes much of the theological discourse through the 20th century, at the very least. And so that all is part of Joseph F. Smith's legacy. I don't know if you could say blame him for that or give him credit for it or whatever your view of it is, but he sort of sets it on that path. I would argue that Joseph F. Smith is not as, and this is a debatable point, I think. Certainly people could disagree with this without being way off base, but I think Joseph F. Smith is far less dogmatic than Joseph Fielding Smith is on a lot of issues. I think he's far less, and part of that is because he's innovating things, and his son is kind of trying to conserve that innovation, and that leads him to be more reactionary in many ways.
Well, and one of those innovations that you talk about, of course, we have a number of what you might call loosely systematizing theologians in Mormonism in the especially mid 19th century, but you talk about in the book how Joseph F. Smith really gets into this idea of systematizing Mormon thought, trying to fit. He has this impulse to try to fit everything together logically.
Yeah. So, the intellectual dimension of this is fascinating to me. And he sort of pioneers a couple of things. One is, like you say, this notion of getting this kind of internally coherent. I guess in some ways it's what kind of Weber is talking about, right? This routinization idea, because even after Joseph Smith's death, yes, Brigham Young is kind of an organizational routinizer, right? He organizes things and stuff, but the intellectual part of it, there's still a lot of debate that happens among apostles and presidents of the church about what the theology means and how do we know what it is and what, and so, the famous Orson Pratt, Brigham Young squabbles. And interestingly enough, one of the things, speaking of things that surprised me, Joseph F. Smith is actually kind of taken under the wing of Orson Pratt and learns a lot from him about this need to create this kind of intellectual coherence. And so it's one of the major projects that he undertakes. Also, how do we know something is true? What role does revelation play in this? And so he kind of pioneers that attitude, which persists in Mormon thought to this day, right? But the way he does it, I describe in the book, is he sort of sets it up so that what happens is the leader decides, and then there's a system in place that allows that to look like everything supports it. All the scriptural interpretation supports it. But as far as historiography goes, if you wanted to talk about that a little bit, there isn't that much, kind of, maybe surprisingly, maybe not. Joseph F. Smith has the first biography of him is written by his son. And obviously this is I don't say worshipful, but it's certainly reverent in its presentation of Joseph F. Smith. And obviously things that at the time would have been considered too hot to handle, I guess, are left out. So, the way that he handles the first marriage is sort of interesting. He doesn't mention, the domestic violence or anything like that, obviously. Sort of suggests that it has to do with, she rejects plural marriage, and that's why they get a divorce. Its main benefit, that book, which I think is just called Life of Joseph F. Smith, is that he quotes extensively from journals that are no longer available. I don't know if they don't exist anymore, or if if nobody seems to know where they are. I have a suspicion I know where they are, but I don't know that for a fact. But he quotes from them. And so it's useful as kind of a vessel of primary source material. Obviously, because I can't see this original source, I have to be kind of careful with it, but it's there. Then I think the next biography of him was written by Francis Gibbons. Francis Gibbons was, I believe, secretary to the first presidency, and he wrote a biography of all the presidents of the church, I think up through, Howard Hunter. It was basically, as you would expect, like a hagiographical treatment, mostly a retelling. I think it was published in the 80s, mid 80s. So it was mostly a retelling of Joseph Fielding Smith's biography from the 30s in slightly more modern language. He wasn't a historian. He wasn't using kind of critical apparatus or anything like that or interpretation or anything. But again, just, for internal consumption, right? These are our church presidents, and here's their greatness, right? Which is what devotional literature is supposed to do. More recently, there's been work on Joseph F. Smith on a slightly smaller scale. So I mentioned the Scott Kenny article that came out in Sunstone, probably close to 20 years ago now. And Scott Kenny had been working on a biography, and his notes are actually housed at the University of Utah. He took really good notes on the journals, and that's where I started before I had access to any of it. Any of that material was Kenny's notes. So he obviously deserves a lot of credit for anybody working on Joseph F. Smith. Then Nate Ricks. He published an edition of Joseph F. Smith's Hawaiian journals from his first mission. And I think he'd been planning on doing more too, but life kind of happens, and he worked on other things, but he was very generous in his sharing sources with me, things that he had worked on or transcribed and stuff like that. And so I think he's written a couple of essays dealing with various facets of Joseph F. Smith's thinking and life and work. And there've been a few others, things scattered here and there in different publications, short articles about things that Joseph F. Smith did and then of course you've got Kathleen Flake's book about the Reed-Smoot hearings, in which Joseph F. Smith features quite prominently. And that's obviously a very sophisticated take on him for that period of his political involvement in Washington, D.C. And that's really, I probably missing something, but generally that was kind of where it was. There wasn't a whole forest of historiography to look through as I worked on it.
This book really gives us our first scholarly or academic biography of Joseph F. Smith outside of the sort of devotional realm of internal to Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. One of the things that really fascinated me about, particularly in the first part of the book, is the way that you lay out your project as a kind of religious studies oriented biography, which isn't something we always see in biography. So I wonder if you could say some more about that.
Biography I didn't know this, right? So I was trained as a historian in a religious studies department. And so religious studies isn't a discipline, it's a field, right? So it's interdisciplinary by its nature. And so in graduate school, I was trained in lots of theoretical things, philosophy, sociological theory, literary theory, anthropological stuff, and of course, history. The particular training that came in useful for this book was the work that I had done on memory and narrative in how it functions in religions. And this is something that interested me very early on in graduate school. I published an article while I was in graduate school about public memory and polygamy, with Joseph Smith's polygamy. And in my first book, there's some work there on memory and narrative. And when I decided to write a book about Joseph F. Smith, I had no idea how to even approach it because my previous work had always been conceptual. Right? You conceive an argument and then you question, right? And then you kind of research it. And then if you're not getting what you want, you change the question, right? And you evolve it that way. But when you're writing a biography, you have this kind of person-shaped mold that delimits what you can and can't do. And so you have to look for other ways of teasing things out, I guess. And so for me, it was what I found kind of a lucky surprise, I guess, was Joseph F. Smith's own obsession with memory and he wouldn't call it this, but with narrative. He's always trying to explain the present in terms of the past. And in fact, he's trying to explain the future in terms of the past in some cases. And he's always trying to tell a story that makes sense, right? It's almost like it's his life goal is to tell a story that makes sense of the present by talking about the past. And so my training in how religions do that, and religious thinkers do that in particular, was very useful in this. Also, this is a guy he's not somebody who's religious and other things. In his own self-conception, everything about him is inflected with religion. Everything about him in his own self-conception is a manifestation of his belief in a very specific set of things, in the God revealed by Joseph Smith, the scriptures revealed by Joseph Smith's prophethood, and Joseph Smith's martyrdom. And of course, the heart of that, right, this Mormon Christianity. And there's nothing about him that he thinks of as being not related to that. And so coming at him from the idea that, okay, he's sees himself as part of a religious landscape, being trained to understand what religion is helpful, particularly because, as you know, right, when you're trained in the academic study of religion, you learn that religion is a unit of culture, right? It's a part of culture, just like everything else that we think of as part of culture. And so it's easier to understand him that way, right? To see what he sees as the culture that he creates and that he inhabits is religion. And so if he's talking about economics, he's talking about politics, and he's talking about sexuality, and he's talking about whatever, he doesn't distinguish between secular and religious. And a good academic scholar of religion doesn't either, right? I mean, the religion doesn't exist outside of its immediate cultural context, its geographical context, its linguistic context. And so all of that made there's a kind of resonance there that made it easy to work with him.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, and again, we've talked about this earlier today, even down to the unit of his own body, right? He doesn't conceive of a secular body or a religious body or things that you do as religious. His very body, even his blood, is tied to a religious worldview that everything is religion, right? There is no Charles Taylor's buffered self. There is no buffered self. It's everything exists in this world, right? So yeah, absolutely fascinating. It's an excellent book, and this book is currently under contract. We hope to see it sometime in the next couple of years, right? What else are you currently working on, Steve, that, if anything, in these pandemic times?
Well, I wasn't expecting that question. My time is mostly spent at editing this book. It's very long at this point, and trying to get it cut down. I do have a contract with Routledge to write a book about the murder of Joseph Smith as part of their series of moments in American history. So that's what is probably up next. I had an article or a chapter of a book in a Signature Books collection that recently came out about the Gospel Topics essays. They asked me to write a section on the Book of Abraham essay, so I did that. And yeah, I mean, of course, I'm always interested in exorcism stuff. That's kind of been I published an article on that. That might become a book at some point. So got a few things in the fire, but really just want to get this book done and see past it. I've spent enough time, I think, with my subject.
Well, thanks for being with us here today, Steve. What I always like to ask people before we go, are you reading anything right now, particularly in Mormon studies, that you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
Oh, let's see. I haven't spent a lot of time reading Mormon studies recently. I read, of course, Sarah Patterson's book, excellent. And I'm blanking on the title. It's Saints in the Attic. Is that what it's?
Pioneers in the Attic.
Pioneers in the Attic. Sorry. Yeah. Again, talking about memory and so on. I'm going to blank on the names and or the titles of these books. I apologize for that. But the one about godhood.
Make Yourselves Gods, Peter Coviello.
Make Yourselves Gods. Yes. Yep. Yeah. I thought that one was really good. Ben Park's book about Nauvoo was good. I read that one. What else? So I guess I've been reading more than I thought I had been in Mormon studies. Sam Brown's book about Joseph Smith. I think it's called Joseph Smith's Translations or something to that effect. An edited collection about producing scripture in Mormonism that was really interesting. Ronald Barney's book about Joseph Smith and memory. I mean, it's a good time. There's a lot of good stuff out there.
That's Steve Taysom. We've been talking about his forthcoming biography of Joseph F. Smith, entitled Like a Fiery Meteor, The Life of Joseph F. Smith. Thanks for being with us today, Steve.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Scholars and Saints. Today, we learned about the private life of Joseph F. Smith. Smith's was a life filled with trauma and tragedy. he struggled to maintain relationships with others, often the result of his extreme machismo and violent temper. Yet he was also surprisingly vulnerable and could be generous and kind, especially to children. Smith led the church through the tremendously difficult cultural and theological transition as the Latter-day Saints became not only monogamous, but American. Next time on Scholars and Saints, join me as I talk with Professor Ronit Stahl about her book, Enlisting Faith: How the Military Chaplaincy Shaped Religion and State in Modern America. Support for Scholars and Saints comes from the Mormon Studies program at the University of Virginia. Music for this episode was provided by Ben Howington. To hear more, visit mormonguitar.com.